So, hello and welcome, it's Neil Dougan here. We're on week 5 now. We're looking at the philosophy around food, and the food itself is actually interrelated with many of the other weeks that we're working with, of course. However, what we're specifically focusing on now is actually the nature of the food. Firstly, what I need to do is actually talk to you about some of the psychological consciousness issues that are going on within us at all times relating to food, but they have a much broader perspective or context as well. Firstly, we need to look at some of the negative emotions or darker emotions that are existing within us, and particularly we're looking at matters such as hate. Now, hate is something which is normally thought about as being applied to another person or to another thing or to an experience or an event or something like that. I hate such and such. But equally, what we see happening with people, and particularly in our modern world, is that we hate ourselves. So through our culture and our belief systems and so on, we're beginning to hate ourselves. And this relationship between hate and how we're approaching our food is incredibly relevant. So as a counterpoint to this idea of hate, we have acceptance. Now, acceptance is an incredibly over talked about positive emotion, but it isn't really very well understood. And for us to be able to accept the food into ourselves and to utilize it in the best way possible, we have to have actually acceptance of the food and the nature of the food, and we have to also have acceptance of ourselves and how we're going to process that food and the purpose to which we're going to put that food as well. Another sideways counterpoint, if you like, to the concept of acceptance, and certainly sitting alongside the negative emotion of hate, is the negative emotion of selfishness. So this is where we really only have concern for ourselves and in that, or our group around us. So what that means is that we're quite happily able to destroy our environment, or take food from other people, or rob money from the poor, which is what we in the affluent world do all of the time. And all of this has actually been promoted by selfishness. Now, this selfishness itself becomes embedded and ingrained in our food supply to the extent that it becomes perverted. So our food supply becomes perverted in direct relationship to the selfishness. So if a negative emotion can have a brother, the brother of selfishness would be greed. And you don't have to think very hard about our food supply and how we're going about producing food to recognize that greed is a massive component of what we're doing with our food production. And indeed, what we've found, and certainly what we're doing with the implementation within TRIM, is that the emotions of fear and selfishness and greed and hate, and some others that we're going to talk about in a moment as well, all become embedded in the food, because that's actually what's driving how we're producing the food. So the consciousness of how we're producing our food becomes embedded in the food, and we're literally eating this stuff. Another one which sits in here is the profit motive. Now, the profit motive can be seen as an aspect of competition, and when I talk about the idea of profit motive, what I'm talking about is that we're engaging in a process for the purpose of profiting ourselves at the expense of another. And in this case, we could be talking about the another aspect of this could be the environment, or it could also be other humans. So, we're engaging in our commercial practices, such as growing food, along the lines of actually trying to make a profit at the expense of other people. So, it's commonly talked about, this idea of large business, and when you're talking about food and massive food production that's going on in the world today, you're really talking about the agrochemical business, and there's so much talked about in terms of the what's driven behind it and how absolutely amoral the modern food industry is, and particularly the agrochemical business. And obviously, with all of this in place, we're talking about here the extent of fear that's existing within our relationship to food is just astronomical. So we're talking about the big three, selfishness, fear and greed here, obviously. And with fear, this actual fear becomes embedded in the food, and as you're eating it, you're actually eating fear. So and all the time you're eating fear, along with these other negative emotions that we're talking about. But with every bite of food you're taking, no matter where that food is coming from, you're actually getting this fear into your body. Now, I can hear you saying, well, I only eat biodynamic food, I only eat food which is produced under conditions of permaculture and so on. Believe me, you can't avoid this consciousness actually becoming embedded in the food. And that's because the food itself, I'm talking about the plants now, or the animals if you're eating animals, but even if you're just a plant eater, if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, nonetheless you are still getting all of these emotions coming through with the food, because all of these animals and plants are in communication with one another, and all of these negativities are actually are becoming embedded within the food, no matter where your food supply is coming from. So, is it all a complete lost cause? Is it, just a matter of throwing up your hands? There's no way that we can do anything about it. Well, clearly not. Clearly that's not the case. And indeed, one of the major stimuluses for me to develop the TRIM program was to create a way where we could actually become much better engaged with the food. And to do that, we have to change the consciousness within ourselves. So in other words, how we are in relationship to our food. So we've already talked about how our food feels about us. So all of those things that we're talking about are the amoral processes that we're engaged in as a species, talking about humans here, and so that actually gets embedded in how the food feels about us. And now what we're talking about is actually what we can do within ourselves to actually ameliorate and improve the conditions, and indeed go out and relieve some of the suffering that the food is actually having on our behalf. So the first one is the concept of natural giving. So this is the Marshall Rosenberg idea. He coined this phrase, but the process of natural giving is extraordinarily important. So when we're talking about the food actually gives up its right to life to give us the opportunity to exist. And we really have to understand and change how we are within ourselves, so that we are giving back to the food by the process of elevating its consciousness through its involvement with ourselves. So that involves obviously helping others. So when we actually look at how our food is suffering, this is where the permaculture and the macrobiotic farming practices and that type of thing come in. When we are engaging in those types of farming processes, then we are naturally giving back to our environment. We are giving back to the food source a much better quality of life. And that principle that we're talking about, that principle of natural giving and helping others, becomes very, very important. So it's not only actually how we're helping other humans or other animals or that sort of thing, but it's also how we're helping the plants. Tied into here obviously is this concept of compassion, and we're talking about some very evolved types of consciousness that the plants and animals are having. In other words, our food sources are having towards us. But things like compassion, humans are able to be involved in these types of emotions and consciousnesses at a much higher level and on a much more it is a higher level. It's the easiest way to describe it is to say a higher level, but it's a more involved level as well. So inherited in all of this is the business of being connected. And when we think of ourselves as an island, there's nothing we can do about anything, and so in other words, we're not responsible for what's going on, we have to recognize that we are all completely interconnected. And in the context of this video, what we're doing here, what I'm helping you with here, is actually really broadening the horizons of actually how connected you are. So you're absolutely connected to these plant foods and these animal foods at an extraordinary level. And that connectedness obviously also applies to how we are with other individuals. So we have a collective responsibility for all of these issues. So you've heard me talk about this before. The number one way that we can actually get around all of these negative consciousnesses that are coming in with food is to actually engender the process of collaboration and cooperation. So putting out to one side the selfishness, fear and greed, profit motive, all of those types of negative things and moving instead in the other direction where we're actually working in collaboration and cooperation. So already we've talked in another video about the idea that how complex our bodies are, and this microbiome, and the fact that we are a community, 70 trillion bacteria in our body, and who knows how many viruses are in our body and parasites and whatnot. And this community is collaborating and cooperating all of the time. The extent to which it has a huge impact on how well we are. So in TRIM, we're obviously working on focusing on getting that collaboration, cooperation to be far greater. What we're talking about here in this aspect of TRIM now is the collaboration and cooperation that extends out to our food supply. So in other words, we're seeing our food supply as being our friends, and we are wanting to actually collaborate and cooperate with them in the process of its consciousness and its evolution of its consciousness as well. So tied into this obviously is the sense of gratitude, and you can't possibly be watching and listening and thinking about this stuff that I'm mentioning here in this video without the need for gratitude to be so obvious. So we talked earlier about the idea of having acceptance of ourselves and our lot and how we are in our circumstances. Well, gratitude is the sister of acceptance. So if we have those brothers of those negativities before, we're talking about the sisters here of acceptance and gratitude. So the last couple of things I want to talk about here are the business of needing to wake up, so to become awake. And we've got a couple of major impulses that are occurring here within biological systems, and very, very highly expressed within humans. And the first one is to wake up. And what that means is to actually finally take away these, obscuring blinkers from our eyes, and to actually see how we relate to our environment, how we relate to our food, how we relate to one another, how we relate to all of the organisms within ourselves, so the microbiome. And we have to actually wake up to it, so we have to be continuously awake. So within the subliminal messaging within TRIM, there's a very, very strong thread about waking up and seeing and participating in what's going on around us. And once again, we have another allying principle here, and the principle, the allied principle to being awake, or the desire or the impulse to be awake, is the impulse to thrive. And we can see that need to thrive and that impulse to thrive within our microbiome. It's very, very obvious within the microbiome, and very obvious within the wider nature, the context of wider nature as well. However, the need to thrive as a species has become completely perverted. So what we're looking at here is the need to thrive as a collaborative organism, as a cooperative organism, so that we can actually see ourselves in the relationship with our environment, with our food. This is the subject of today's video, is food, the philosophy of food, and that impulse to thrive as it relates to allowing this sort of energy of thriving to occur within our food. And if we think about how our modern food supply is, we can see that what we're trying to do is to dominate our food and to suppress it and to have it fit into our own plans. When I say our own, they're hardly my plans, but nonetheless I have, as an individual, I am partly responsible for this collective consciousness that we're talking about here. So it's up to me, and it's up to you, and it's up to everyone around us who are waking up to also go into this new relationship with thriving, so that we're all absolutely thriving towards an evolutionary process. And the evolutionary process that we're talking about here, of course, is actually it's not changing our bodies necessarily, or changing our minds even, but actually the evolution of the spirit. Okay, so look, I hope you found this useful and interesting. We're going to be talking much more about how we connect to the particular types of food that we are eating, particularly when we look at appetite, which is next week. However, what we're talking about here today is actually the relationship between ourselves and the food, and between the food and ourselves uniquely. Thanks for watching, and make sure you keep posting those questions on Facebook. Thanks very much.